Okay, so welcome everybody this afternoon to supporting students with separation anxiety. Okay, can we have the next slide, Annie? Okay, so just to say we are going to be talking about resources, we're going to be talking about links and things throughout the workshop. Don't be alarmed, you don't need to write them down. We will send those out and there will be a resource section at the end as well. So don't kind of feel you have to frantically write those things down. So in today's workshop, what we're going to be covering is what is separation anxiety. So giving you a bit of a broader understanding around what that means. Why might children experience separation anxiety? Emotion-based school avoidance. So what does that mean? Supporting students with separation anxiety, and then we'll also signpost you to some resources and further support. Okay, so I'm going to start with what happens when a child separates from their parents. Well, ideally, if a child has a really strong and secure attachment to their parents, they consider their parents as a secure base, or even a safe haven. So we kind of sometimes you might have heard those sort of terms bantered about. So the image on this slide shows you the circle of security. And it's kind of when a child feels really safe with their parents, they feel confident enough to try going out and exploring the world on their own. So they kind of go away and try to do something new. And especially sort of as a young at a young age, they want that parent to still kind of watch over them, still look out while they're trying to kind of do that new thing that they've decided to try out. And they want kind of parents to kind of delight in their explorations and their successes, but also if they're needed to kind of be there to kind of pick them up, help them out if it's needed. So children that kind of start the world feeling really secure are often more confident to kind of try something new. But they kind of come back to the parent and want to kind of feel protected, comforted. They want to kind of feel organized with their parents. And they also want to kind of have that sense that what they've experienced is being made sense of with them. So, and obviously I appreciate this relates to very young children, but that is kind of ideally what we start out with. Okay, so if we then kind of think about separation anxiety, it's kind of quite a normal thing actually at some developmental time points for infants and toddlers particularly. So for some young people, however, that separation causes significant anxiety and it can continue beyond sort of preschool age. So, so it can kind of be a normal part, but actually as it kind of prolongs, as it carries on, and causes significant anxiety, it can become quite a difficulty. So, it can interfere therefore with school life, it can interfere with sort of daily activities. So if this young person that you're working with feels incredibly anxious and it's been going on for a really long time and it's really intense, it affects their functioning in multiple domains. And most frequently, this relates to children's anxiety about his or her parents as well, but it could also relate to kind of closer caregivers or other kind of difficulties. So we know that the idea of new experiences away from their parents or other loved ones can be quite scary for children. So, and when we kind of feel scared as a young child, sort of about trying something new, we kind of often kind of experience things like upset stomachs, headaches, or something else is often how children kind of show that anxiety and that fear. So often kind of a strong physiological response, really. They might also be worried about something bad happening during that separation. They might become quite clingy, pleading or tantrums are common kind of just before that separation. They might also kind of report having nightmares or refusing to sleep alone. Or need frequent reassurance that everything's going to be okay. So this anxiety can make separating from parents or carers in order to go to school really difficult and may lead to school avoidance. It's normal for a child to have worries about returning to school after a break. So, we've got the summer holidays, obviously, of course, at the moment. We have a lot of young people who struggle with that transition back into school after the long break. But it's also natural for parents and carers to miss their children after spending maybe a prolonged period of time with their youngsters. because I guess the summer holidays particularly are quite an unusual length of time to kind of maybe spend together. So examples of separation anxiety might be not going to school or sleeping with the parents in bed at night time, not seeing friends outside of the home, checking in on parents constantly, so kind of checking they're okay. And it might present differently depending on the young person's age. So just to bear that in mind. Okay, so why might children experience separation anxiety? I guess that's a really good question. So as we said, some levels of anxiety when being away from kind of the safe base of the parent or the caregiver is normal for children, particularly when they're sort of 8 months to 3 years old. But separation anxiety will often increase when facing transitions, but will normally reduce over time. So we kind of have this ebb and flow, and that's kind of perfectly natural. However, some children may struggle much more than others with appropriately separating from parents, for example, to be able to come into school. So why might that be the case? Well, we also want to kind of hold in mind the impact of COVID and lockdowns on kind of separation anxiety increases. We've kind of learned that it was unsafe to be around others, and we've learned to stay close to our family. And that's been quite an intense time for pupils that are going to your schools, but also yourselves maybe as teachers. So separation anxiety has actually increased in lots of youngsters. So you may have already heard of the iceberg idea. What we see in here in children, in their behaviour, their facial expressions, their words, is only a really small part of the story. So under the surface, there may be much more going on than what we kind of know, what we understand, because it's more difficult to see that part. Separation anxiety may present in many kind of ways, and that's kind of what we see above the surface, maybe. So we might see crying, we might see sort of shaking, or saying they feel ill when they're having to come into school. They might feel nauseous. You might see some aggression, or even running away and trying to be trying to be kind of um, with the parents, or kind of escaping schools. So so there's kind of that avoiding school altogether, maybe, or quickly finding a reason to ask to be sent home once the day started. So there's that kind of desperate kind of difficulty of getting in, acting out, maybe sort of being aggressive, shaking, crying. So there's a whole range of kind of ways that might present itself. Okay, but what we know that the way in which young person behaves doesn't necessarily tell us everything. So behind these behaviors, under the surface, there's a much more to the iceberg. And if you can give me the next slide, perfect. So often many factors at play, and we know very little about the young person is actually kind of thinking or feeling. So it's quite hard to know what's going on underneath all of that. Um, and therefore it's quite hard to work with those bits that are driving some of that kind of expression, really. The behavior you see is triggered from feelings and thoughts, which may not be obvious to you. These deep-rooted feelings and thoughts will be based on many things, including past experiences, self-image, social roles, skills, and knowledge. So what we're saying is be really curious about what might be lying beneath the surface. There's likely to be lots going on for the young person, and we might just not be aware of it all. So, and I guess you can see on the ice underneath the iceberg and the bottom, you can see lots of different kind of reasons. You've got low self-esteem, sadness, uncertainty, feeling overwhelmed. So there's a lot of different kind of reasons, or sensory overload, academic problems, why somebody might be really struggling to come into school. Okay, so when children are toddlers, they learn to slowly tolerate being away from their caregiver. So we've already mentioned that, and that other people can be safe. So they start off with their secure base with their parents or caregivers, and then they learn to kind of transition this to another adult or other adults. So this learning process can be impacted by experiences, and that's the part to hold in mind. Some children are born with maybe a more sensitive temperament, and that might mean that they're more likely to be cautious or alert to potential dangers. And that innate kind of temperament might also be sort of impacting with environmental factors. So attachment between parent and child can be impacted by things like traumatic events. And that can be things like loss of a family member or a parent suffering a significant illness or hospitalization. And that can be physical, but it can also be a mental health difficulty, difficult transitions. So, for example, having to flee the childhood home, maybe because of domestic violence, or having experienced a negative transition from one school to another. There could also be the impact of lack of exposure to other adults that aren't the parents. So if we sort of think about the kind of COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, our children had very limited exposure if they were staying at home during the pandemic. So so I guess that can create an increase in the anxiety levels of our young people. Okay, so what happens when a child experiences separation anxiety and why does it continue occurring? So we've got this lovely diagram here, which is kind of talking you through that cycle of what happens. So at the top, you have the anxious feeling about separating from the caregiver, and that leads to kind of negative thoughts about the ability to cope without the caregiver. So it might be that the person's thinking, oh, I can't be away from mum today, I might be worried. I might be worried about mum because she's not being very well. So there might be then that level of distress separating from the caregiver because they're so worried about them. And the distress response from others who are inclined to rescue the young person from the distress because actually mum might also be worried about the young person going to school. So, and then that might lead to kind of an urge to sort of avoid that separation from the caregiver or using safety behaviours. Maybe I'll text mum during the breaks while I'm at school, if they're allowed to have phones or if they've managed to keep their phone. And then that might give them a really short-term relief for both the young person and the caregiver. So that kind of sense of easing of that anxiety, that stress. But the trouble with that is it reinforces that need for avoidance and that drive for avoidance. And it means that the cycle continues. So it's about understanding that cycle and thinking about how do we kind of break that cycle rather than increase that anxiety about separation. But I guess it comes down to needing to understand what's beneath the surface as well. So what's the driver? Okay, so emotionally based school avoidance is the term used when students have severe difficulty attending school due to emotional factors. So it's distinct and different from students who are absent because they're truanting, just because they don't want to be in school. I remember when I was a kid, there was a real kind of trend to let's kind of skip out of school. That's not what we're talking about this afternoon. This is literally where we're talking about a group of people who have prolonged absences because of specifically emotional distress that they experience around attending school. So it's emotionally driven, not kind of peer pressure or a trend of kind of just truanting. So the term school refusal can be really unhelpful as it locates the problem within the young person and the pupil, and it implies that they have full control over that attendance. So therefore, we're much keener to use the term emotionally based school avoidance. So emotionally based school avoidance occurs when stress exceeds support, when risks are greater than resilience, and when pull factors that promote school non-attendance overcome the push factors that encourages attendance. So what you often find in emotionally based school avoidant children or youngsters is that they have this push and pull, but actually that the pull dominates. So they haven't got enough to encourage them to attend school to overcome that kind of pull. Okay, so we've got another Slido for you, and we'd like you to think about why might a child avoid attending school? So what are your experiences? What are you thinking? A young carer, yeah, great. So they have other responsibilities outside of that. Bullying, yeah, yeah, because it's too difficult. Might have long time bullying, yeah, physically, emotionally. Peer difficulties, doesn't want to leave the parent. Yeah, young carers again, just don't want to go. Previous negative experiences, poor relationships with adults or peers, worried about mum's safety. Okay, yeah. Fear of failure, unidentified unmet needs. Yeah, bereavement. Yeah, worry about parents at home, trauma. There's a lot of lovely variety, isn't there? Works too hard for them, yeah. Negative relationships at school, yeah. Is that with teachers or peers or both? Yeah, their own mental health, friendship difficulties. That's often a really common one in teenagers, particularly. They're feeling scared, doesn't want to do the work, feel unsafe. Okay, I'd be interested to know more. Journey difficulties. So is that getting to school? Yeah, can't engage with the learning. So that being too difficult for them, I'm assuming. A couple more. Yeah, feels they can learn better at home. I guess, yeah, lots of people during the pandemic lockdowns kind of meant they prefer working from home. Worry about not being picked up after school. Oh, wow, okay. Feels unable to do the work. Yeah, lack of parent role models. Yeah. Okay, so I think what we can see is that there's a huge range of reasons why a child or young person may be avoiding attending school. Okay, so back to our iceberg model. On the surface, in the behavior, we might be seeing the child repeatedly avoiding coming to school for days or even weeks, despite the best efforts to encourage or reassure them. As we know, there's much more about the surface than we often realize, underneath the surface, sorry, than we realize, to explain those pull factors of what's pulling a child away from engaging in school. So we know that since the pandemic, more young people than ever have been struggling to attend school. Given all the changes to schools that lockdown has brought, it's not surprising that some young people found it really difficult to return, and also kind of teachers and parents returning to work for that, really. But particularly those that found it maybe a struggle pre-pandemic already. So we've split up the reasons for school avoidance here in three categories. We've got child factors, family factors, and school factors. So if we start by looking at the child factors, we might be thinking about things like temperament, trauma history. So somebody mentioned that on the previous slide already. And it often school avoidance often means students are avoiding uncomfortable feelings. So that's anxiety, low mood, which come on due to kind of low self-confidence, fear of failure. Somebody mentioned that on the slide as well. Specific learning needs or due to trauma memories being triggered. And that can be sounds, can be smells, can be all sorts of different things. So just bearing that in mind, it's not always the obvious. Um, so yeah, so most young people won't share trauma experiences, but I guess it's just holding in mind that that's a possibility. And it's about being mindful that there are often lots of factors that we might not be aware of. It could also be that could be neurodivergent difficulties such as learning disorders, social communication, or sensory issues, which might be making the young person feel more fearful about coming into the school environment. So just hold that in mind. There's also, of course, the sensory kind of sides of those, so kind of sensory overload. Okay, so if we move on to family factors, there could be a whole range of different family factors. Could be parents divorcing or parent separation, loss of a bereavement, family member being very unwell, and remember kind of physically, but also in terms of their mental health. Perhaps even the child is having to be a young carer, like a few of you mentioned on the last slide. So not only are they worried about sort of being separated from their family, but they might also kind of have a really practical role in looking after that family member. It might be that they're living in an abusive family dynamic, which might also be contributing to the young person not wanting or feeling able to leave the home. And I guess that kind of might be for multiple reasons. Overprotective parenting could also contribute to the child being avoidant or even preventing them from going into school. Being the youngest child in a group of siblings, and also there being a family history of emotional-based school avoidance, either of a parent or maybe another sibling, might also be contributing. If we think about school factors next, the most common school factors associated with emotion-based school avoidance is bullying. So that was mentioned on the last Slido as well, or problems with peers, as mentioned in the Slidos, which makes sense, as particular for teenagers, who are acutely sensitive to how their peers perceive them and treat them, I guess if we kind of think that's a threat or a problem, that makes it really difficult to attend school. So if the young person's going into an environment where they think they're going to be bullied and their experiences have been that they've been bullied or teased or excluded by their peers, it makes kind of sense that they want to avoid that at all costs. If children are struggling with certain lesson subjects or feel they're falling behind academically, or perhaps maybe feeling the pressure to perform and achieve in exams, I guess they can all be contributing factors to why young people want to avoid going into school. Okay, so transition periods, so returning after the summer holidays, as we've already mentioned, moving schools, going from primary to secondary school, that's often a really big trigger, we find, or even just the increasing demand of moving up a key stage, because there's more pressure attached to that. It might be that it's the structure of the school day. They find it really demanding or overstimulating as an environment. So there kind of might be that kind of sense of it's too busy, too loud, too noisy, or the lighting. So they might just become really overwhelmed by some of that environmental sort of setting. So staff as well as peer relationships are really important. If a child or young person doesn't feel they have a positive, trusting relationship with you, then that becomes also quite a contributing factor. So the reasons behind emotion-based school avoidance are often really complex, as we can see, because there's a lot of possibilities, and I've only mentioned a few really. And those possible factors interlink, and together they can contribute to the school avoidance. So it might be that it's a multitude of factors that are leading the young person to struggle attending school.
Thanks, Emmy.
Okay. And I shall pass you over to the lovely Annie next.
Thanks, Emmy. So we're going to think now about how to support students with separation anxiety. We're going to start by thinking about noticing our own reactions and connection before correction, then think about understanding the problem and making the link with anxiety, ways that you can support underlying factors, and then we'll finish talking about a graded exposure approach. So just for a second, I want to pause and have a look at this picture and assume that the student in the picture is reluctant to go into school. He doesn't want to leave his mum and he doesn't want to go into school. And I just want you to think about and notice, what are your first thoughts seeing this picture, seeing this situation? What comes to mind? How do you feel? And hold that in mind. So what do you notice in yourself when a young person is struggling to separate? Might be kind of at the front door of the school, like in the picture, or it might be parent calling in and saying, my child's not coming in again today. What emotional reaction does that create for you? What are some of your responses or initial thoughts about that? Worried. Yeah, absolutely. Sad. Empathizing with both the child and the parent. Yeah, sadness. Feeling emotional. Yeah. So sad for both the parent and the child. I think that's really important. You want to go and reassure them. Yeah, frustration. I think that's really important to name. It can feel really frustrating. Yeah, concerned, wondering why. Frustrated again, wanting to help, wanting to support. So really feeling that empathy. Wanting to give reassurance. Yeah, so a range of different emotions. And I guess we wanted to start with that just by acknowledging that this is really difficult particularly when students are avoiding coming to school. It's natural that is bringing up really difficult emotions for everyone involved, including you as staff. And it's important to notice those natural responses. So there might be a mix of feeling worried and feeling empathetic and wanting to do something. There may also be some frustration and you've got a lot of pressure on you, particularly that sort of start of the day. There's loads going on, lots of children to be paying attention to, and it may feel really frustrating that there's a particular child or family who's not coming into the classroom. So it's helpful to just be aware of that and be thoughtful about what emotions and thoughts are coming up for you. And the narrative that we give young people about what's happening around them is really important. So if a young person is hearing from the adults around them, and that might be their parents, their school staff, maybe clinicians, if they're hearing of, oh, they can't cope, this is too much, they're not going to be able to do it, they will internalize that and think, well, I can't cope, I'm not going to be able to do this, there's no hope for me. But if they're hearing a narrative that there is some belief that that young person can cope or things can get better, then they may start to internalize that and believe that. If we think about the language that we're using around children and think about talking about brave behaviour, of how brave it is that they're trying to come in today even though things feel difficult, rather than focusing on, no, they're refusing and they're not going to be able to cope, which feels really final and really difficult for a young person. And also modelling confidence, showing that you have some belief in that young person that they can cope if they come into school, and you're confident that they will feel safe enough in school with the support that you've got for them. And that links really nicely to connection before correction, which if you've been to any of our workshops before, you may have heard us talking about. So this is really about the idea that even though we might have a drive and an instinct to really push a young person to try and get back into school, try and be brave and come in, actually we need to first connect with them, to join them where they are, come alongside them and attune with them. So connect with them and understand, what is it that's going on? Where is this young person at? And what's happening for them in the moment? And first focusing on that positive connection with them, really that understanding and them feeling that you are somebody safe that they can come alongside with and share how difficult things are. And once you've come alongside a young person and they trust you to feel connected to you, you can then together do the correction and do the working on what feels challenging. So gradually challenging that avoidance and bringing them into school. And this is an approach that's talked about by Kim Golding, called the two-handed approach. So connecting first and correcting once that connection's established. So how can you understand a problem with a young person or with a family? So it's going back to thinking about that iceberg. So finding a time or space to think with the child and their family. Importantly, it's helpful to have this as a sort of team discussion around the child. What is under the iceberg for this young person? What is going on for them? If there's difficult emotions like anxiety or low mood, what is that relating to? Are there things going on in school that's really kind of making them feel avoidant or not wanting to go? Or are there things at home that's kind of pulling them away from even trying to go into school because they feel they need to be there? So it's thinking together and coming up with a shared narrative with that family and that young person about what's under the iceberg. What is the difficulty here? And we do have a template tool for these conversations, which we've trialled at Thurston School in the past. So if anyone is interested in a copy of that, do send our admin email address a message and we can share that with you. Because once you've got a shared understanding, then as a team around that child, you can much better address the problem and try and make a plan for making things better if you've all got the same understanding. And one thing that can be really helpful when thinking about what's under that iceberg is helping the child and potentially the parents understand anxiety. So you may want to refer back to an anxiety cycle like we introduced at the start. So why separation anxiety keeps going when a child uses things like reassurance or avoidance. But if you help a child understand their anxiety, so their fight or flight response, and what's happening in their body when they feel that fight or flight response, then they are going to understand what's happening a bit more. And it might not feel quite so scary. So that initial anxiety that they might feel at the start of the day, if they understand a bit more about what's happening in their bodies, then they can be reassured that it is just their body's natural alarm system that's going off, but that those symptoms will pass and they will be able to cope. And that in itself, just understanding anxiety a bit better, can help to bring that level of anxiety down. And we've put a few resources on the slides here about ways that you can talk about anxiety with young people and kind of share with them what's going on in their bodies when they feel anxious. And we will share these slides with you, so don't worry about writing all of these down. So how can we support some of the underlying factors under the surface of the iceberg? So we've put supporting underlying school factors here because, as we discussed earlier, there's other child and family factors that can contribute to separation anxiety and school avoidance. And it will be really useful for you to identify which of these are at play for particular children. And there might be something that you can do as a school to support with child or family factors. So you might be able to support with emotional literacy by giving the child access to an ELSA. You might be able to meet with the family more regularly just to get to know them better and to build those relationships. You might want to refer the family for a CAF maybe for some family support. But we recognise that many child and family factors will need to be addressed outside of the school as well, whether that's through support from other services such as mental health services or from early help or children's social care. So we wanted to focus today on what you can do as a school to increase those push factors. So what is going to encourage and motivate that child to attend school? So to push them into school and away from that level of safety at home. So what we want to do is be increasing push factors, but also reducing any school-specific pull factors that is pulling them away from wanting to go in and making them feel anxious. So these are some of the areas that we're going to go through. So firstly, as we've been talking about a lot today, something that's absolutely key to those push factors for a child to feel motivated and safe enough to come into school away from the safe base of their parents is by increasing the positive relationships that that child has at school. And that's thinking not just about staff, but also about the peer group around that child. So creating a sense of relational safety at school is absolutely key to a child feeling that they want to come in and they feel they can cope if they are in. So that might be having a key adult or at least consistent adults around that child, them knowing who they can go to if they feel overwhelmed and anxious, maybe dedicating a bit of time for a couple of key adults or one key adult to really focus on developing an understanding relationship with that child, to build that connection before correction, so that the child feels there's at least one adult in the school who gets them, who really understands what's going on and that they can talk to about what's happening. Peer support is also really important. So as we talked about, bullying is one of the key factors why children might refuse to go to school or avoid going to school. So if you're aware of any bullying that's going on, it's absolutely imperative to address that and to nip it in the bud as early as possible. But also just thinking about perhaps a child might be a bit lonely. They might need some support with making friends or linking in with other kind of peers who have similar interests to them. Some children really struggle with making friends and without some support from the adults around them. Or they might find it helpful just to have a buddy, maybe a buddy in their class or a buddy from a year that's older than them who can kind of show them around the school or kind of have somebody they can go to where they feel a bit safer and like they've got somebody they can trust. It's about thinking about how to help that child to feel seen. What might make them feel like the people around them at school understand them, they're noticed and they're valued and they're wanted there? How can they feel nurtured by the people around them? So as I said, that might be one-to-one time with staff, but it could be thinking about kind of peers and what can be supportive for them there. And then in terms of the relationship between the school and the family, so that can be really tricky. There can be some really difficult narratives, perhaps if the family themselves may have a history of kind of avoiding school or struggling at school. There may be some really difficult narratives in the family around that child about school and what it means and whether they can cope with it. But the more that you can be feeding back positive feedback to the family, the better. So rather than just focusing on speaking to the family when perhaps a child has missed a lesson or they've not come in, it's also thinking about, can you also be providing some positive feedback to that same family? So perhaps an email at the end of the week saying, you know, although they really struggled to go to their math lessons this week, their contribution to their science lessons was fantastic and they did really, really great. Or it was a pleasure to see them here every day this week. Brilliant achievement, well done. So thinking about feeding back that positive feedback to show to the child and the parents that they are all valued in the school and you really want to see them there. And there's a really nice video that's called Every Opportunity, which there's a link for there, which talks about the little opportunities throughout the day to help a child feel valued and seen and safe. So it could be as simple as a hello in the morning, or asking how they are, or noticing that they've got new shoes or something like that. Just a kind of a simple little hello can be enough to make a child feel that they've been seen and valued at school. So that video is a really nice watch in terms of thinking about relationships and connections and those small, simple ways of doing that in the school day. So a sense of belonging and purpose. So this is absolutely critical to a child genuinely wanting to be in school, that push factor of wanting to be in school because they feel that they're valued there. And this might change over time. So children may well be growing up through your school and their identities will change over time. They might get interested in new things. They might find out more about themselves over time. And you can be there to help them discover who they are and to flourish and to really enjoy learning about who they are. And flow activities is something that could be really helpful to think about. So a flow activity, if you haven't heard of it before, is something where somebody is so interested and engrossed in what they are doing in a particular activity that they might completely lose track of time and be completely mindfully focused on this certain activity. And flow activities are different for different people, depending on what you're interested in and what you like. And to find activities that kind of put a child into that particular flow state where they feel interested and engaged and challenged, but kind of relaxed and mindful at the same time, those sorts of activities are really helpful to think about. Can you build more of that into that child's week at school? Or can they do some of those activities maybe at difficult times, such as a transition at the start of the day? So some children that might be Lego, it might be colouring, it might be singing, it might be reading, that kind of thing. Different things for different children. And again, just thinking about that need for motivation. So what can reinforce their brave behaviour? We're asking young people to do something that's really difficult. There is anxiety there about coming into school for some reason. There may be really difficult reasons why that child doesn't want to leave their home. You know, perhaps their parent is unwell, or perhaps they've been through something really traumatic with their family. So we've got to think about what is in it for them in terms of coming into school. What is going to motivate them to help them feel that they want to at least give it a go to try and overcome that avoidance and face those fears. So it might be intrinsic or extrinsic motivators. So intrinsic might be more kind of internal, what's meaningful for them, what's important. Extrinsic motivators may well be the sort of practical rewards or treats. And that might be needing to sort of be negotiated with family of what's your kind of reward system going to be, if that's something that's going to be meaningful for that child. But it's about thinking about that child's own values. So does that child really value being a hard worker or being somebody who is brave and adventurous and taking on challenges? Think about what feels exciting to them, what kind of brightens them up and makes them think, oh yeah, that would be worth giving a go. That sounds really exciting. And also thinking with them, how might it feel to overcome those fears? So if you could wave a magic wand and get rid of the anxiety about school, what would be good about it? What would be better about being able to come into school? And that's a really nice question to try and work out, what is it that is motivating for this child? Because if they say, well, if I was able to come into school, then I would get to play on the particular climbing frame that we have or something. And then you work out that actually they really love play and they really want to be in to do that. Or they might say, well, if I wasn't anxious, I could come in and learn more about history because that's my absolute favourite subject. And then that's something you can work on and think about how to build that as a kind of a real motivator for them to come in. So before we think about sort of specific transitions, what have you found most helpful when trying to transition a child into school when they are finding separation difficult? So this could be with children who are experiencing EBSA, so completely avoiding school, or it could just be a child who's struggling to separate from their parent at a particular day, particular time. Showing them that you're there for them, absolutely. Yeah, so that really meaningful relationship. Distraction, yeah, that can be really helpful. A soft start, yeah, that's a nice example. Reassurance, no judgment. Yeah, exactly. Just allowing them some time. Meeting with a friend. Yeah, so a peer connection at the start of that day. Not rushing. Yeah. A constant person, so a sense of consistency of their routine. Yeah. Giving a job, that's a really, really nice example. So that kind of feeling valued and needed at the school can be as simple as giving a child the task of passing around the books at the start of a lesson. Just gives them a feeling of, I'm needed here because I've got a role to do. Let them have their moment and take a second. Yeah. Thrive activities. Yeah. Start the day with play. Absolutely. That can be really helpful. Rather than going straight into a lesson, some young people need to start with play, or they might need to start just with some quiet time. Yep, so low demand activity, reducing cognitive load. There's loads of really nice examples here. Really nice. Just wait for this. One more comment. Talk about, yeah, that's really nice. Talk about what they have to look forward to. So once they're at school, thinking about what is it that's going to motivate them to be there for the day or the week or later that term. That's a really, really nice example. Thank you, everyone. That's great. So thinking about the transition. So you've already come up with loads of really nice examples. So we've just got a few other examples here. So some young people might find it helpful to have a transitional object. So this might be particularly important, perhaps if a young person has really genuine worries about a parent for, a really quite worrying reason. Maybe their parent's very unwell or something like that. So bringing in something that they can keep with them during the day to remind them of that connection with that caregiver, that they're still there for them, can be really helpful. So younger children might find maybe a blanket or a teddy helpful. Other children might find it helpful just to have a picture of their parent or something like that in their pocket that they can look at. I once worked with a child who absolutely loved her pet tortoise, and she liked thinking about her tortoise during the day when she got worried about being away from home. So they found a little keyring with a little tortoise on it, and she had that in her pocket that she could pull out and look at every time she worried about being away from home. So thinking about what's meaningful for them. Thinking about goodbyes. So for some young people, that separation can be so worrying that you need to really think about how they say goodbye or how they do that actual separation from the parent. So curiosity about what is the current routine and how helpful is it? So if it is that the child particularly struggles separating from their mum, and it's their mum who brings them to the school gates every morning, and they have a hug for 10 minutes and they try and kind of literally drag the child away from mum, that sounds really difficult. Could there be maybe a different person could bring that child to school, or mum could walk them to outside the school, and then somebody can meet them and take them to the school building. So thinking about how helpful is the routine, and is there something that could be slightly different? So that might involve thinking about who's the best person to drop off the child, or could there be a more consistent routine? So some young people might struggle with this kind of routine being different each day. And then familiar and easy to understand scripts. So that's for both the parent and for the school. And particularly maybe neurodiverse children who might find the kind of concept of time quite confusing. So they're saying, I will see you again at 3 p.m. at the gates, and I look forward to it. That might be helpful to remind that child, this is only temporary. I'm dropping you off, and when the clock says 3 p.m, that's when I'll be back here again. And it might be helpful to think about, can a trusted or kind of key adult for that young person meet and greet them at the start of the day and support them? And if they're not able to, then just thinking about how to share with that child how they can access a trusted person if they need to. So we've got some top tips here about managing transitions, many of which I think you've mentioned already in your Slido responses. So welcoming the child into the school, creating a soft landing, so somebody there to welcome them, enabling readiness for learning, so thinking about reducing that arousal at the start of the day, and some of those anxiety resources might be helpful, or flow activities. Building in regular resets, so potentially opportunities to calm and lower that arousal again throughout the day. Perhaps at break time and lunchtime, those transition times can be a bit disruptive. Developing an agreed signal with the child for when they feel too overwhelmed at school. So how can that child signal, actually, this is getting too much and I really need some one-to-one support? Considering how to manage break and lunch times, again, that's often very challenging. And developing a Monday morning plan and routine with the child. And that can start on Sunday at home. So a shared plan between family and school, if this is what happens on a Sunday evening and this is what happens on a Monday morning, that can help reduce some of that anxiety about the uncertainty of the transition from home setting to school from Sunday to Monday. So we're going to finish off by thinking about graded exposure and then share some resources, and then we've got a few more Slidos to finish with. So as I'm sure many of you already know, when we're trying to tackle emotionally based school avoidance, or actually really any kind of avoidant or phobic type reaction, research shows us that the most effective approach is to use a graded exposure approach, which means that we're identifying a clear goal for that person to work towards, such as returning to school, and then breaking this down into smaller, achievable steps towards that goal so that it feels more manageable. So it's about creating a clear plan of gradual steps to facing that feared situation, slowly building up confidence along the way. So why does this help with the cycle of separation anxiety? Well, ultimately, by challenging themselves to face the feared situation of going to school or whatever the particular fear is about, the young person breaks this cycle of avoidance, or at least seeking reassurance. And they have the opportunity to learn new, positive information about their worries about that situation, to teach them that they can, in fact, cope with what they thought they couldn't. So they learn that they can manage not texting mum during the day or going into school and being away from mum for the day. And they build confidence over time to try more and more challenging things. And the reason that's important is that it creates long-term, lasting reduction of anxiety and getting more out of life, rather than those things like short bits of reassurance, reassure them maybe in the short term by texting mum, but ultimately they're still fearful about being away from mum. So challenging that and seeing that they can cope with what they thought they couldn't gives a long-lasting reduction in anxiety. So here's some kind of general bits of advice about making a successful graded exposure plan. So collaboration is really important. As we've talked about a lot today, your shared understanding with the child and the family is absolutely essential to being able to create a meaningful plan. Being realistic is helpful. So thinking with the family about what's going to be a realistic first step. You know, if a child's not been attending school for weeks, it may not be realistic for them to expect them to come in for half days for the whole week straight away. Might be more realistic to think about, can we do one half day and then review and see how it goes, or even one lesson or something like that. Giving control, so helping the child and the family feel that they are in control of what's happening to them. If a child feels like they are being done to and something is being planned for them that they're not in control of and not on board with, it's not going to be successful. Thinking about pace, so thinking about working alongside the family at a pace that feels comfortable for them. So if a plan is going too quickly or too slowly, then that's going to feel really difficult for the family. And it might break a sense of trust. So if a child feels they're being rushed into something that doesn't feel comfortable, they may feel that the people trying to rush them don't understand them, and that might be quite damaging to that relationship. Being flexible, so thinking about the kind of plan for what you're going to be doing, but thinking about adapting that over time based on what's working and what's not. It might need to change, and you might need to see how the first couple of steps on that plan go and then reevaluate. And then encouragement. So steps on the plan always need to be something that's worth achieving, or something that the child is going to feel like they've got some motivation to do. So if the first step is to come in for one lesson, what is their favourite lesson? And maybe that could be the first one that they start with, because it will feel like something that's meaningful and worth trying. And encouraging them at every step along the way, that you've got their back, you're working alongside them, and you really, really want to make a success of it with them. So this is an example ladder that you might use. So we use the analogy of a ladder. Some people use a pyramid, lots of different ways of thinking about it. So you start at the bottom of thinking about what's the first step that you could try. And for this young person, it's meeting a teacher alongside a parent at school. And they would practice that step until that feels comfortable, until that feels manageable. Then you would take the next step of meeting a familiar teacher alongside the parent regularly. So moving it to being more regular. Then the step above that, once that feels comfortable, is separating from a parent to go to a friend's house for an hour. So this doesn't have to just be about school. Separating from a parent can be to go and see a friend, or to, I don't know, go out on a bike ride with somebody else who isn't the parent. So thinking creatively about what else might be meaningful. The step above that is doing a part-time timetable and continuing to meet that familiar teacher, so keeping that success going. Increasing the part-time timetable and adding in staying for lunch, and then getting to the point of doing the full-time timetable. So this is just an example, and I'm sure you will have had various different examples of things you've used before. So we've got a couple of pages of resources here, which in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through in loads of detail, but we've got some resources and toolkits, some previous workshops that we've done. The Every Opportunity video is there. And we've got some resources for parents and young people as well, which you may want to signpost families to for help on these areas. So with a few minutes left, we just want to check in whether this has felt helpful. This is genuinely helpful for us to know, so that we can think about how we do things differently for future PD days. I think this is the first time we've done this topic on a PD day, so really helpful for us to know if it's useful, if it's kind of meeting what you're looking for. Thank you, everyone. That's really, really helpful. Great. That's really nice. Okay. And if you can, could you rate your knowledge again of separation anxiety and emotion-based school avoidance in young people? So how would you rate your knowledge with where we're at now? That's lovely. So still a bit of a spread, but at the higher end, I think. I can't quite remember our average from the beginning, but that looks higher to me. That's really good to know. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And then your confidence in supporting young people with separation anxiety or emotion-based school avoidance. So how 10 out of 10, that's lovely. We like to see a 10 out of 10. Great, that's really helpful, everyone. And knowledge and confidence might be a bit different, because it's sometimes can feel a bit different knowing the theory and the confidence of using things in practice, but that seems a bit higher as well. That's lovely. Thank you, everyone. And then our final question is just about which 2 key things would you take away from this workshop? And we asked this for a couple of reasons. Partly, as I said, it helps us know what to keep in if we were to run this session again in the future. And also we know that we generally remember things better if we're asked to write down what we've learned, or to at least kind of note down what's felt important. So to help you guys keep things in mind, what have you found most useful? Circle of security and flow activity, yeah. Graded exposure. The iceberg idea, yeah, really important. Unpicking the push and pull, yeah. Positive when greeting, yeah. That there's a number of different issues that can affect a young person. It's really helpful to have in mind, isn't it? Just the vast volume of things that could be going on for young people that we might not even be aware of. Permission to take time when needed, yeah. How to explain push and pull factors.